So I guess he's back in jail. And then when they took all the jail people, they all went to court. Then I guess it's his turn. They put him in front of King, and then King told him, "What secret is in my daughter?" He told him, "Big star up in the air." So he, the king, have to keep his word. He married the princess. So this kind of story amazes me. I don't know where it come from. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian. Today we're talking about Amber and Robin Ridington's Performative Translation and Oral Curation, Tijan Chezin in Beaverland. This is an interesting article. I have a couple of problems with it, and they might sound a little bit spiteful, but I just want to sort of brush through them quickly because I want to get to the article's strengths. There tends to be this issue in folklore's closest disciplines, which is anthropology and ethnomusicology. We won't even talk about English literature. But that sort of tends to be they're disciplines that are both ethnographically based, clearly, and fieldwork based. And there tends to be this strange understanding that folklorists are only interested in collecting, and they're only interested in collecting for the purpose of sort of creating these great tables of narratives like the Tale Type Index. But it strikes me it's almost as if they anthropology and ethnomusicology stopped reading folklorists in 1965 and have based all their methodological assumptions on that, and sort of kept on going. So there's a certain amount of dismissing that Robin, who I imagine is the primary writer of this, we'll get to that in a second, where he's sort of discovering things like the Tale Type Index and then saying, "Oh, but there's nothing about performance in here, and I'm all about performance." Whereas, and then he very selective, one or two contemporary folklorists like Carl Lindahl and a little bit of Alan Dundas and so on. But there's a lot that's gone on that if he had read the folklorists, he would have been able to answer his questions. Amber Ridington was, as the footnotes say, when this was happening, she was just starting her master's program in folklore at Western Kentucky, and doing her, and this paper was originally written for the folk literature course there, and then it was expanded on by Robin in order to turn it into a chapter for this compilation, Born in the Blood, on Native American translation. And judging from the table of contents of the book, much of it is about the translation of Native American languages and Native American texts in Native American languages into English written texts. So taking these things that are primarily performative and then turning them into something for the analysis that is suitable of the textual analysis. They are interested in what happens when a story is translated through a chain of translation by Native American tellers themselves, but for the purposes of performance, to create something that is subject to a different kind of analysis, the analysis that is what an audience does. Come prepared with a certain set of expectations of what comprises story, what comprises relevant story, what comprises artistry, and has those expectations both met and also unmet, or rather met in a unique and surprising way. And in that frisson between what is known and what is new, artistry emerges, which is, I think, sort of standard folkloristic analysis of what comprises performance. But anyway, I want to get talking about the strengths of this. Could have peppered in some more folklore references, and it would be wonderful, more wonderful than it actually is right now, but it is still pretty darn wonderful. So Robin Ridington had been working with the Daneja, and just to, as a quick aside, the Z in za is somewhere between sort of an uninflected Z and the Z in pizza, so it's a Daneja. I'm probably going to mess it up a little bit, and apologize ahead of time, but I am trying. I listened to how it's pronounced 20 or 30 times, and I think I kind of got it. Anyway, so this is northeast BC, and they were nomadic people until the Alaskan highway sort of ran right through their territory, at which point they settled down a little bit, although still working primarily on the land through hunting, and then also through participation in the modernity that was imposed upon them. But they've been in contact with part of the fur trade, at the very least, since like the late 18th century. They've been in contact with Cree and French Cree and Anglo, plus all the administrators that would have been coming through that path, plus churches and so on who ran the schools. They were fortunate is not the right word, because, but you might say they were more fortunate, or they were less unfortunate than other First Nations people, in that they didn't have a residential school imposed upon them. So while they were enculturated through the Anglo school systems, they could go home at the end of the day and speak their languages. So they weren't stripped of the ability to speak language for years on end. So they had there's greater fluency than you might find in traditional languages than you might find in other First Nations communities. But Robin had been studying this groups since the late 1960s, and he emerged as a graduate, not a graduate student. He had just become faculty, and was made contact with the Danizaa, sometimes referred to as the Beaver people, and the language is sometimes referred to as Beaver as well. And and was interested in clearly in a sensitive way, was genuinely interested in the culture of the Danizaa, who were recognizing that even though it was a remarkably rich and thriving, and certainly in comparison to what they were seeing elsewhere in other First Nations communities, or what they heard of what was happening in other First Nations communities, they also recognized that their culture probably could benefit from cataloging and preservation. And so they and Robin worked quite closely, and his wife Julia, and then eventually their daughter Amber, worked quite closely for decades, which led to the interesting point of this particular article, because they'd been going for 30 years, and then one day, as they're on this long drive, he's got his mini disc recorder going, because he's always recording. Do you remember mini discs? No, you don't, kids, but they were fantastic for what they were. So this disc was running, and one of his primary collaborators, a man called Sammy Acko, who was born in the 1950s. His brother was born 1916, and his father, Ray Aku, their father, Ray, was born in 1879. And Sammy was, and the entire family, but Sammy, the person he happened to be in the truck with at the time, was a recognized master storyteller and community historian in the group. He, and sort of, don't know if the word elder is appropriate here, but of that sort of level of status within the community. And said, you ever hear this one? And ever the story of the Chezan? And Robin says no, and Sammy launches into it, and it becomes a fascinating issue, because it's clear that for 30 years he's been dealing with this dude from the university who is interested in their stories. And it all hinges on this issue of, if I come to you and say, please tell me your stories, the critical word in that sentence is your. Because when you say it, when you, who are some prof in with big hippie hair and suede pants, which is exactly how his watched a video where his wife describes where they first met and what he looked like when they first met. This sort of hippie comes in and says, "Tell me your stories." It's like, okay, this is what I understand your definition of "your" to be in the sentence, "Tell me your stories," and proceeds to tell him 30 years of Daneza stories that are about origins, that are sort of have a clear lineage through ancestry, as it were. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he tells a story that Marx is like, I don't know where the Daneza learned this story, and tells him a Tijan story. Now, Tijans are basically what we think of when we think of Märchen. Tijan is French corrupted, well, not corrupted, that's not the right word, contracted French for Petit Jean, Little John, Jack. They're Jack tales. They are about a young, unlikely hero from poor circumstances, modest means, little was expected of him, and through circumstance, through chance, but mostly through demonstrating the skills and the qualities that are found useful and positive within a community, which include often such things as generosity and kindness, but can also imply guile and reserve and slyness, is almost miraculously, but is rewarded for those qualities through the help of magical agents, through the help of donors, through the help of friends, is able to fulfill this particular quest that is asked upon them. They resolve some problem for someone else, and lo and behold, they're able to be elevated from their modest circumstances and come to marry the princess, almost inevitably marry the princess. So this is something that would be recognized by Vladimir Propp. This would be something that would be recognized by Christensen in Denmark as sort of bog standard fairy tale traditions of the pan-European but not exclusively European variety. And so and it enters into the Daneza repertoire somehow. The somehow is interesting, and he spends a lot of time trying to figure out the somehow. And those are good, healthy questions to ask. Why not? And I will always sort of at the same time go on that. Answer them. If you can find an answer, that's fantastic. But that isn't the actual question that you need to be asking, because it's about how this narrative works today. So, we get to read a lot of his stuff where he talks about the Yarn-Thompson index and kind of poo-poos it. And again, if you'd read sort of anyone recently, it would be fine. And he comes up with a couple of interesting ideas. And one of his ideas is this idea of performative translation, which is kind of cool. So it's about sort of standard observations of storytelling, in that people at the moment of performance, the storytelling event, they shape the thing that they are going to tell, whether you want to use words like George's idea of messages, if you want to have the communications-based center, or the text, whatever you want to call the thing that is about to emerge in the verbal art and the act of verbal art. They shape it according to the expectations of what will comprise a good performance, where good is highly localized and specific to the instance, the people who are there. They shape it to audiences. And they will do this because that is what is expected upon them. That's what's really incumbent upon them. Now, performances can be bad. You can make mistakes, but that is the aim, is to create something that meets the expectations of the audience, or at least fulfills most of the expectations of the audience. But they will, they can create, and they can do this more or less spontaneously. So he Ridington is kind of fascinated by the idea that Samiako can take this received text, despite the fact that it seems to have been received, at least a generation ago, and that he was raised with this text as well. But at one point, at the very least, this text seemed to hop traditions, as it were, move from, and it is a genuinely interesting history that one can extrapolate, even if that genuinely interesting history is not necessarily essential to the instance of performance, where it went from perhaps European French to North American French, French Cree to Beaver, and Beaver to In That Truck in 1999 into English, and that he's able to create a narrative that meets aesthetic expectations, that is a good performance. And you can analyze the text all you want, and he does so, and that's great. And he's bringing 30 years of time he's writing this, 40 years of deep understanding of Danizā aesthetics and narrative to the fore, and that's great. And read those footnotes. But again, it strikes me as not a self-evident point, but a point that shouldn't necessarily be surprising to us if we have been reading and studying folklore for, even just a little bit. That is one of the fundamental storyteller's arts, and we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised, despite the fact that Samiako is not well versed in European folktale traditions. He's incredibly well versed in Danizā narrative traditions, and so the idea that he can adapt easily shouldn't strike us as strange. Another term that they've coined, that Amber seems to have coined, is this concept of oral curation, which is a kind of an interesting idea. The notion that storytellers, using her definition of it, the process of oral transmission which simultaneously maintains the plot structure and setting of a story and provides an opportunity for it to be tailored according to each performance context. And by using curation, it kind of extends the museological metaphor, because we talk about song in terms of collecting, and we think about song in terms of itemizing. And that if we're going to think of these texts as objects, then curation is more than the simple accumulation of them or the simple display. Rather, it is the presentation of those objects in a way that is both preserving, but also making them ongoingly meaningful for the audience. So they're reflective in that way. And I think it's a positive direction that the term has. But again, one of the things that strikes me is it still seems to suggest that there is some kind of essential thing that is the tale itself. That there is some kind of itemization. That's not quite the right word. The objectification of tale, by turning it into some kind of object that somehow exists independent of performance. And that the tradition bearer, if we're going to use those words, the tradition bearer has some kind of responsibility for maintaining the notion that the narrative has some kind of essential element to it. That they are simultaneously protectors of the very things that they perform. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it's because I think we're still sort of struggling with this notion. And I think I think I think the performance-centered approach would rigidly reject this reject this idea of curation, because it is still so focused on the idea of these things as objects. And it's something that is passed down and handed down, and the language that we use about tradition bearers implies, even like bearing, it implies weight. It implies something that one carries for a while and then passes on. So I think embedded in those descriptors is this language of the text as a thing that can exist independent of the act of performance itself. So this notion of oral curation is kind of fascinating, but then it puts the onus, well, if this is the idea, it puts the onus on the tradition bearer by the analyst, by the folklorist, by the anthropologist. And it's like, how are you at the very least adverting to the essential European origins of this narrative? Or how are you taking that into account? And I fundamentally don't think it is the tale teller's responsibility, or at the very least, the question doesn't necessarily need to enter into it. There might be a bit of a double standard, because I would probably be quite hackled were it to be otherwise, were an Anglo storyteller to have adapted a First Nations narrative into their own repertoire and not take that chain seriously. But we're talking about two different ends of a power spectrum, and we need to sort of address the issue of what comprises appropriation and what comprises adaptation. And for me, the issue of appropriation has to do with, given the legacy of all the literal capital and literal wealth and literal theft, or literal capital and literal wealth that has been thieved through the processes of colonialism or slavery, or all those institutions. You can't take our cultural forms as well. Like, that's the last straw, as it were. And so, the process of adaptation which I think is fundamentally one of the great things that we can do. So we can take forms and find new meaning in them. Needs to have a little bit of a thrust put in them when the issues of the consequences of colonialism have yet to actually be fully worked out. It's like, are we forgiven? Cool, I can take your stuff now, because forgiveness and reconciliation hasn't happened yet. Anyway, that's my little high horse. But I think there's just sort of a little dance that's taking place here, where I wish they'd read more folklorists. I wish they'd read more narrative people. It would be wonderful. But it is a really interesting discussion, and the text that is actually created, the performance that Samiako does of that narrative, it's wonderful. We can analyze it. It is remarkable, the resilience of that pattern, both as through sort of Holbeckian analysis, through Ulrichian analysis for that matter, through Proppian analysis, how well that narrative can hold up to these dusty European tools of analysis, while at the same time clearly being found meaningful to the teller and the immediate audience that the teller is normally telling those narratives to. And then the great insight that I have from this is this issue of that sentence, tell me your stories, and the your, man, that's open to a host of interpretations. So, wonderful reading. Highly recommend. 2 thumbs up. Robin and Amber. Oh, just put in the order that they placed it in. Amber and Robin Ridington's Performative Translation and Oral Curation. As ever, my friends, I wish you very, very, very the best. Bye-bye.